Hi, it's Mr. Y, the Social Studies Guy, with another episode of our YouTube series focusing on Ohio. Today we're here with Arya, our little Buckeye girl, okay? And she gets to travel around quite a bit, so she's seeing a lot of the things and places that we're going to talk about today in our short video series. So you may recognize her a little bit, and if you haven't seen her, you're probably going to see a lot more of her, because she is just a little Buckeye. Okay, well, today, continuing our America's 250 here in Ohio, our theme for this month is transportation. Now, boy, oh boy, there's a lot to talk about when we talk about transportation in Ohio, because so many things happened here. And when we look at, obviously, when people think of the Wright brothers, with good reason, okay? But we're going to talk about them more in detail when we go into our part of our series about aviation. But we have to understand how many important things happened in this state that have revolutionized transportation as we know it. For example, in Bellefontaine, Ohio, we have the first concrete street in the United States. We have many different inventions that were here. We had Alexander Winton in Cleveland, Ohio, develop the first American car with a steering wheel. Can you imagine that? It was all tillers before that. That was actually 2 years before that, an inventor in France invented a steering wheel. It looked nothing like our steering wheels today. But Winton's was the kind of steering wheel we have on our cars today. We have so many different technologies. Charles Kettering at Dayton invented the self-starter. As we know, those original cars had a crank, and those cranks caused lots of dangerous injuries. So Charles Kettering, a great inventor, okay, along the way. And then we have in Fostoria, Ohio, the cars that were invented there, which we're going to talk about in our automotive section, were the first enclosed cars in the United States. Think about that. The old term, the horseless carriage, okay, they were all open. Well, I like convertibles as much as anybody, but can you imagine? They didn't have enclosures till right here in Ohio that happened. So as we talk about transportation, we're going to talk about a lot of people, a lot of places along the way. Now, you probably know our neighbors to the west, Indiana, call themselves the crossroads of America. And I beg to differ, because I really think with our interstate systems, with all of our highways, we kind of fit that also. But we had a slogan here in Ohio called Ohio, the heart of it all. And I believe that slogan, which was on our license plates at one time, really fits into what we're going to talk about today, because we have so many interesting things as we go through transportation in Ohio. Now, for a lot of people, the Ohio Turnpike. Well, sure, we have a great Ohio Turnpike system. We have a lot of interstates, like Interstate 71, Interstate 75, Interstate 90. We have a lot of state routes, State Route 224, right here in Green Springs, Ohio. Right now, we're on State Route 19. So there's many state routes throughout the state. There's a lot of different ways that people could travel throughout the state of Ohio today. And you know what? It's one interesting thing I think a lot of people don't realize is that when we talk about our major cities in the United States, we think of New York City, we think of Chicago. Well, guess what? Exactly halfway between those two big cities is North Jackson, Ohio, in Mahoning County, this side of Youngstown. That's the halfway exact point between those two major cities in the United States. So we have a lot of things that we're going to talk about today. Now, we have, obviously for people today, they think of airports. So we have, Cleveland has a major airport. Columbus has a major airport. We have, airports in Cincinnati, smaller airports in Akron, Canton, and Dayton, and Toledo. So that's another thing. Again, we're going to stress some things on aviation in Ohio along the way. But let's go back in history. Let's go back to the beginnings of our state. Now, again, you have to realize that Ohio was totally forested. The entire state was totally forested. And it was said that a squirrel could travel from one tree and never touch the ground from Ohio all the way to Indiana. So again, when the pioneers came in, they used Native American trails as their first way of getting through the forest. Today, we look at a lot of the different roads. We have a road, State Route 101, that goes from Clyde, Ohio to Castaijo. That is exactly the path of a Native American Trail, right out here in Green Springs, Ohio. Route 19 follows the Native American Trail along the way. So that's what they did. And eventually, of course, they developed their own roads along the way, because Ohio was, think about the isolation. You had the Appalachian Mountains to the east. You had the Lake Erie on the north. You have Ohio River on the south. So again, they had to come in here and clear things to build their settlements, to build their cabins, but they still based the transportation on those Native American trails. So we have to give credit to them along the way. Now, we all know something called the National Road. This was the first road the government put in to connect the East Coast with westward expansion. So when the National Road comes into Ohio, that made a huge difference as far as people settling this state. Now, the National Road today is US 40, running just south of Interstate 70. You could still take that today, still see many markers and things along the way from the National Road. And we start looking at the fact that our interstate system today is the 5th largest in the United States. So there's many different ways to get around Ohio. We're going to talk a lot about them. Okay, one of the things I really want to talk about when we move to our next section is we go back to Ohio itself. Henry Howell, the noted historian, wrote several volumes of Howell's historical collection of Ohio. He traveled around the state interviewing the original settlers, and he comes back later on and does another one. But the original book, what happened was Henry Howell was determined to walk the entire state of Ohio. He did that and then realized, no, I can't walk the entire state. So he ended up buying a horse and traveled like most people did, horse-drawn transportation. That was the way that people traveled throughout Ohio, with horses and wagons. But a real interesting development comes up in the 1830s, and that is a way to transport goods much cheaper than using wagons, and that was Ohio's canal system. Now, one of the great things about Ohio's canal system is today you could go to several places, including Roscoe Village, which calls itself America's Canal Town, because it is actually a restored village with costume guides. It's a wonderful place. You could take that canal boat ride and see what it's actually about. There's another one in Canal Fulton, another one in Grand Rapids. So you have different places to do it, but the canal system, the whole idea was connecting basically Lake Erie to the Ohio River. And it's interesting that one of our future presidents, former president, but at this time he was a future president, was James A. Garfield, who was a canal boat driver. And he thought that's what he wanted to do with his life. But unfortunately, he fell into the canal 3 different times, and probably the fact he couldn't swim made him rethink his future and decide to go to college and end up being, of course, one of our great presidents. So that was interesting. But I have to tell you just a very quick story, personal note. When I taught 7th grade Ohio history, I taught a lot about the canals, but I can remember students saying, oh no, not another film strip about Ohio's canals. Kind of shows how dated I am, okay, along the way that we used film strips back in the day. But the canals made things so much cheaper to transport, and that's why they were very popular during their heyday. But what happens, of course, is their demise comes about because of the railroad system in Ohio. Now, the railroad era in Ohio, of course, today we still have many, many railroads that crisscross Ohio, but what happened was that the canals, as I mentioned, ran north and south. But for many of the settlers, they wanted to have a way to go east and west. So that's how the original railroads were put into the state of Ohio. It's really interesting that the first railroad that we had, Ari's enjoying this part too, was the Erie, come on Ari, you're such a good dog, okay, she's going to be a superstar, okay, was the Erie and Kalamazoo Railroad, the first one in Ohio, and it was actually the first railroad that was west of the Allegheny Mountains, and interestingly enough, it ran north instead of east or west. It ran from Toledo to Adrian, Michigan. But you'll see that, we see a lot of things like the Mad River and Lake Erie Railroad, okay, the first chartered railroad in Ohio. Now, it's interesting because today, if you're really interested in railroads, there's so many places to visit that have railroad museums. Bellevue, Ohio has a wonderful one that's there, Denison, Ohio, and I would really encourage you to see those because, again, there's so much in the way of railroad transportation, which is still very important today if you look in the state of Ohio, and I think that's something you would really enjoy. Now, the railroads are followed by what was an interesting thing called the interurban, and Ohio had the largest interurban system in the United States. And what's really cool about that is you can still see remnants of that in different towns along the way. The system ran all the way from Cleveland to Toledo, and a lot of smaller towns were stops there with the interurban that had it. And today in Chippewa Falls, you could actually go to the Interurban Railroad Museum, and it's really, you can actually take a ride. They have one of the trains that actually operates there it's several acres, and you go through it, and the guides there are very passionate about what they're offering people. So railroads in an urban, very important in the state of Ohio. Well, one of the things Ari likes to do is take car rides with the windows down. No matter how cold it is, she always likes to have her windows down along the way. But we already gave a few mentions earlier of the automobile industry because it was so important in the state of Ohio. Because, we think of, obviously, Detroit, Michigan, the Motor City, everything like that. Do you know that Henry Ford actually considered putting his first plant right here in Ohio? He thought about it. He was visiting friends in Clyde, Ohio, and thought about building it there. But the location in Detroit made a little more sense because of the transportation along the way. But we have many automotive things that happen in Ohio. Now, what happens is Cleveland, Ohio was a major part. We mentioned Alexander Whitten already, but we talked earlier in one of our videos about the traffic light was invented in Cleveland, Ohio, the first traffic light in the United States. But as far as the automobiles that they had, there was many that were really very popular during that time. They had, for example, they had the Baker, the Jordan, the Peerless, the White. All those cars were very popular at that time. And the Baker was really the first, what they considered a two-seater car that would make people, encourage people to travel along the way. It was the first one, and they had a lot of interesting innovations in those Baker automobiles. And Thomas Edison, the famous inventor, bought one of those. That was his first car, was a Baker. And what's interesting about it is he eventually goes to work for Baker Electric, so he works for the company that he bought his first car from. That I thought was really very interesting. So what happened is that he actually, what he did was he developed these nickel batteries for that car. First one to have those along the way. The Jordan was an interesting car, and their slogan was, cars are too dull and drab not to have a sporty car. So they were actually considered a sports car. And the most famous model they had was called the Playboy. To give an example of how they wanted to make a sporting type of thing, something fun to drive in. The Peerless was one of what they called, very importantly, the 3 Ps. Packard, Peerless, and Pierce Arrow. These were the ones that were high living for, we talked today about Rolls-Royce, Bentley, for example. But back then, these were the brands that the movie stars, they wanted to have. Packards, Peerless, Pierce Arrow. Those are the cars that the very wealthy drove along the way, but all of them made right here in Ohio. And it's interesting because so many of these cars today, you could go to these museums, like for example, the Packard Museum in Warren, Ohio, is one of the most outstanding automobile museums in the United States to find out the history of that brand along the way, because they were luxury automobiles. They were ones that people were very proud to own. Again, you look at the innovations, as I mentioned, the modern steering wheel, for example, okay? The first air-conditioned car in a passenger car, Packard. First, can you imagine that? They were the first ones. So owning a Packard was considered to be, you made it, okay? That's the way, along the way. Now, remember, the first cars were called horseless carriages, okay? Well, the Columbus Buggy Company.
And we will be back right after this.
Well, we got a little interruption there with modern technology, since I forgot to turn off my cell phone, which I apologize for. But anyway, we were talking about the horseless carriage era and the Columbus Buggy Company, obviously in Columbus, Ohio, that what's interesting about the cars themselves were wonderful, but what's really cool about it is they had two of their employees, well-known employees, Eddie Rickenbacker, the great pilot, we think of Rickenbacker Air Force Base in Columbus, and Harvey Firestone, okay, from Firestone Tires from Columbiana County, Ohio. So, so many of these people were interested. This whole idea of automobiles was still fairly new at this time. So another car manufacturer was in Cincinnati, okay, and that was the Crosleys. Now, Crosleys were interesting cars because they were considered, today we think of Corvettes, obviously, as far as the two-seat sports car. But the Crosley Hotshot was the first one actually really promoted as this is a car that you're going to get attention in, people are going to notice you in this Crosley Hotshot. So that company there had a lot of really interesting things along the way. And, of course, how can we not talk about Jeep? The vehicle that became known during World War II in the Army, the utility vehicle that went through anything. Well, the first Jeep that was made for commercial, for people to be able to buy it, was right here in Toledo, Ohio, and still continues. Jeep is synonymous with Toledo, Ohio. So we think about that along the way. The Glass City, known for the Jeep factory. A little bit more about automobiles you might find interesting. Smaller towns in Ohio also produced automobiles, such as Clyde, Ohio, where they produced the Clydesdale trucks and the Elmore cars. What's interesting about the Elmore cars, at one time in our country's history, all taxi cabs in our nation's capital, Washington, D.C., were all Elmore cars made right in Clyde, Ohio. Now, Plymouth, Ohio, is an extremely interesting town in Richland County, and Plymouth, Ohio had the first Plymouth. They actually made two Plymouth cars. And what happened was, and they made a lot of different trucks and different things along the way, but the Chrysler Corporation ended up actually suing them for the brand name of Plymouth, and the corporation won. So when you think of the Plymouth cars today, of course they're no longer made, but the classic ones like Barracudas, Roadrunners, for example, those were not made in Ohio, but the two original ones are extremely valuable, as you might imagine. Now, Fostoria, Ohio had Allen Motors, and Allen Motors made actually 20,000 vehicles. So they were really very successful at one time. Now, today in Ohio, of course, we have down in Marysville, Ohio, the large Honda and Acura plants, which build many, many vehicles, including the Honda Accord, CR-V, Acura RDX, TLX, and of course I mentioned Jeep in Toledo, and they make all of the Wranglers and Gladiator pickup trucks in Toledo, Ohio. And of course in Avon Lake, we have a large Ford truck manufacturing company in Avon Lake. And of real interest is, for popular culture people, we think of the Batman and Warner Brothers with Batman. All the Batmobiles were made in Toledo, Ohio. So that's important to know that we've had a lot of different manufacturers. Some people very familiar with Studebaker. Well, they were not here in Ohio, but they produced a wonderful car called the Avante, which again was kind of a very sporty car. And when Studebaker went out of business, okay, they ended up selling that particular brand. And in Youngstown, Ohio, they actually had the Avante Motors Company, but it went belly up, unfortunately, too. But I could go on and on about all the different auto things. There's a lot of auto museums in the state of Ohio. Take advantage of those. You'll find out about the different type of techniques that they used to make Ohio a leader in the automobile industry. Well, when it comes to aviation, as we talked about obviously in the beginning about Orville and Wilbur Wright, their bicycle shop in Dayton, Ohio is where all the ideas came from about flight. Now, as you know, they were known as extremely inquisitive. And the whole idea of having a airplane, that plane airplane was so, most people could not imagine that at that time along the way. And we have to understand that, of course, the first flight does not take place in Ohio. It takes place in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. Okay, so we could say, though, with good reason, that yes, we were the ones here in Ohio with the Wright brothers, Orville and Wilbur, who developed aviation as we know it today. Even though the first flight only lasted for 12 seconds, but it changed the world as we know of along the way. So today, what happens is you could actually go down to Dayton, visit the bicycle shop. It's so interesting because you could actually go to one of the great museums in Ohio, the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force, located at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, the largest military museum in the world, and right there in the same town where the Wright brothers lived. And of course, when we start talking about space as we moved on, Ohio, the fourth largest producer of astronauts in the United States, including Neil Armstrong, the first person to walk on the moon, John Glenn, the first person to orbit the Earth, Jim Lovell, Judy Resnick, Sunita Williams. You'll find all about them and more at the Neil Armstrong Space Museum in Wapakoneta, Ohio. So Ohio has gone from those Native American trails to the moon. Transportation in Ohio has gone for so many different ways, but so many firsts happened here, so many famous people. So get out during this month of transportation, drive around, see different places we mentioned in our video today, and as always, thank you for watching.